General Velthar walked into the war room with heavy steps, and his forearms hung low by his sides as the massive doors closed behind him with a soft hiss, and the sound echoed through the chamber like a death bell. And he knew that what he was about to tell the High Command Council would change everything they believed about war and conquest, and maybe even about themselves and their entire empire that had ruled the galaxy for over 3,000 years without a single major defeat. Until now. The council members sat in their floating chairs arranged in a perfect circle around the center of the room, where holographic displays showed the current state of their war against the humans, and the red marks on the star maps told a story that made Velthar's stomach turn with shame and disbelief, because every red mark was a lost battle, and every lost battle meant thousands of dead Christian soldiers who had been trained from birth to be the perfect warriors and who had never known defeat. Until they met the humans' honored council, Velthar said, and his voice carried the weight of someone who had seen too much death and too much failure. I stand before you today not as the victorious general you sent to conquer Earth 6 months ago, but as a soldier who has learned that everything we thought we knew about warfare was wrong. The eldest council member, Zorthak, leaned forward in his chair, and his ancient eyes glowed with the kind of anger that had burned through. 47 conquered worlds. General, you were given the finest fleet in our empire and 300,000 of our best warriors, and now you return to tell us of failure against a species that barely learned to travel between stars, Velthar. Activated the holographic display, and the room filled with images of human soldiers in action, and he pointed to a young human male who was leading a charge against Christian heavy infantry, despite being outnumbered 10-1. This is Sergeant Kim Taewin of the Human 3rd Marines, and I want you to watch what he does when his position becomes hopeless. The hologram showed the human sergeant squad pinned down behind cover as Christian plasma bolts turned the air around them into superheated. Death and any rational being would have surrendered or retreated, but instead the human stood up and shouted something to his squad, and then he charged directly at the Christian line while firing his primitive projectile weapon, and his squad followed him without hesitation. Even though they all knew they were going to die, he could have surrendered, Velthar said, as the council watched the humans tear through his troops with nothing but determination and fury. His squad was cut off, and they had no ammunition left and no chance of rescue, but they chose to attack instead of give up, and they broke our entire formation with that one impossible charge. Council member Sixara shook her head in confusion. This makes no tactical sense, General. And surely this was just one isolated incident of madness and not representative of their entire species. Velthar changed the display to show Captain Park Minji organizing the defense of a human colony against overwhelming odds, and the council watched as she moved between defensive positions while enemy fire fell around her like deadly rain, and she never once looked afraid or uncertain as she coordinated a brilliant flanking maneuver that saved her entire battalion from certain destruction. Captain, Park had multiple opportunities to evacuate with the civilian population, Velthar explained. But she stayed to cover their retreat, and when our forces surrounded her position, she didn't call for surrender terms or try to negotiate, and instead, she led a counterattack that destroyed 3 of our armored divisions and cost us more ships than we lost in the entire Zephyrian campaign. The general paused and looked at each council member's face as he prepared to deliver the most difficult truth. Honored Council, I have commanded fleets for over 2 centuries, and I have seen every type of warfare known to our species, and I have studied the combat doctrines of every civilization we have ever encountered. But the humans fight like no one else in the galaxy, and they fight in a way that makes no sense according to any military theory we understand. He activated another display that showed human communications intercepted during various battles, and the council listened to recorded voices of human soldiers as they faced certain death, and some were laughing, and some were singing, and some were just talking calmly to each other, as if death was nothing more than an inconvenience they had to deal with before getting back to the important business of killing as many enemies as possible. Listen to Private Cho Wanbin as he refuses medical evacuation while wounded so he can continue defending a civilian evacuation route, Velthar said, and the council heard the young human's voice saying he was fine and that the medics should help someone else who needed it more. even though his injuries were clearly fatal, and he died 3 hours later but never stopped fighting. Here is Lieutenant Kang Sora manually detonating explosives while trapped in one of our bunkers. The general continued, and they heard the human female laughing as she activated the charges that would kill her, along with 50 Cresian soldiers, and her last words were about hoping. Her sacrifice would give her comrades enough time to complete their mission. Council member Velkors stood up abruptly, and his voice shook with anger. "This is not warfare, General, and this is insanity and madness, and no civilized species fights this way." "That is exactly my point," Velthar replied, and his tone was deadly serious. "They don't fight the way civilized species fight, and they don't follow the rules that every other race in the galaxy follows, and that is why we cannot defeat them, because we are playing a game with rules they refuse to acknowledge." The general activated a tactical display that showed the overall strategic situation, and the red marks indicating human victories covered nearly half of the contested territories. In 6 months of fighting, they have not retreated from a single major engagement, and they have not surrendered a single strategic position, and every time we think we have them trapped, they find a way to not just escape, but to inflict massive casualties on our forces while doing it. Look at the Battle of Proxima Station, where Commander Lee Hyunwoo was outnumbered 50-1, and his fleet was crippled, and his supply lines were cut, and he had no reinforcements coming, and by every rational calculation, he should have surrendered to preserve his crew's lives, but instead he ordered his remaining ships to ram our dreadnoughts, and his damaged cruiser took out our flagship while his crew sang their battle songs as they died. The council chamber fell silent as the implications began to sink in, and Velthar continued his report. "I intercepted their final transmission before the ramming attack, and Commander Lee simply told his crew, 'We hold the line here for Earth and for humanity.' And then they charged our entire fleet with ships that were already falling apart, and they were singing as they died. The humans have a concept they call going down swinging, which means that even in certain death, they will inflict maximum damage on their enemies, and this is not desperation or panic or battle madness, but actual military doctrine that they teach to their soldiers from the beginning of their training." Velthar looked around the room at the shocked faces of the most powerful beings in the Cratian Empire. "Honored Council, I must tell you that we are not fighting a war against an inferior species, and we are not facing primitive warriors who will eventually be overwhelmed by our superior technology and tactics, and we are fighting against something that challenges every assumption we have ever made about the nature of warfare itself." Velthar activated a new set of holographic displays, and the war room filled with detailed tactical readouts from dozens of engagements where human behavior had defied every principle of military science that the Cresian Empire had developed over millennia of conquest, and the general's voice grew heavier as he prepared to explain exactly why their most advanced strategies were useless against an enemy that refused to follow any logical pattern of warfare. "Consider the Battle of Kepler Station," he said, and the display showed a three-dimensional map of the engagement, where human forces had been completely surrounded and cut off from any possibility of reinforcement or resupply. Commander Lee Hyunwoo had 17 ships against our force of 800, and his ammunition was nearly exhausted, and his shields were failing, and any reasonable commander would have begun surrender negotiations to save his crew's lives. The council watched as the tactical display replayed the battle in real time, and they saw the human commander's fleet formation change from defensive to offensive, even as enemy fire overwhelmed their positions. And Velthar pointed to the moment when everything changed from a standard siege into something none of them had ever witnessed before in their long military careers. Instead of surrendering, Lee ordered his remaining ships to form attack formation, and he broadcast a message to his entire fleet that said, "We hold the line here for Earth and for humanity." And then 17 damaged human ships attacked 800 of our finest vessels, and they sang as they died, and they took 43 of our ships with them, including our flagship. Council member Zorthak leaned forward, with disbelief etched across his ancient features. "This cannot be standard human doctrine, General, because no species could maintain an effective military force if their commanders regularly chose suicide attacks over tactical retreat." Velthar changed the display to show battle after battle where humans had chosen death over surrender, and the pattern was so consistent that it could not be dismissed as isolated incidents of battlefield madness. Honored Council. I initially thought the same thing, but after analyzing over 200 separate engagements, I have discovered that this behavior is not the exception among humans, but rather their standard operating procedure. The hologram showed Private Cho Wanbin during the defense of Colony 7 as he dragged wounded civilians to safety while Christian plasma bolts burned through the air around him, and even when he was hit 3 times, he continued moving people to the evacuation shuttles until he collapsed and died while still trying to reach another injured civilian who was crying for help. Watch Private Cho's actions during the evacuation, Velthar said, and his voice carried a strange note of respect that made the council members uncomfortable. He was hit by plasma fire 3 times, and any of those wounds should have incapacitated him, but he continued fighting and saving civilians until his body simply stopped functioning, and his last words were an apology to the civilian he couldn't reach in time. The display shifted to show Lieutenant Kang Sora during the assault on Fortress Prime, where she had volunteered for a mission that everyone knew was impossible, and her squad had been tasked with infiltrating a Christian stronghold that was defended by 5,000 soldiers and automated defense systems that could track and kill any intruder within seconds of detection. Lieutenant Kang knew that her mission was suicide, but when I interviewed captured humans, they told me that she volunteered. Immediately, when asked who would take the assignment, and she told her commanding officer that someone had to do it, and it might as well be her, and then she infiltrated our fortress and manually detonated the fusion charges while laughing, and her last transmission was her hoping that her sacrifice would give her comrades enough time to complete their mission. Velthar paused and looked directly at each council member. The fusion explosion that killed Lieutenant Kang also destroyed our entire ammunition depot and disabled our shield generators and allowed the human fleet to break through our defenses and capture the fortress. And that single act of self-sacrifice changed the outcome of the entire campaign, council member. Sixara stood up and her voice carried the confusion that all of them were feeling. General, what you are describing is not military strategy, but mass insanity, and no civilization could survive if their soldiers regularly chose death over survival. That is where you are wrong. Honored Sixara, Velthar replied, and he activated another display that showed human casualty reports compared to their tactical achievements. Human forces have suffered terrible losses in every major engagement, but they have also achieved objectives that should have been impossible given their technological disadvantages, and their willingness to die for their missions has actually increased their overall strategic effectiveness. The hologram displayed a detailed analysis of human combat psychology that Velthar's intelligence teams had compiled after months of studying, captured recordings, and intercepted communications, and the data painted a picture of a species that approached warfare in a fundamentally different way than any other race in the galaxy. The humans have a military principle they call acceptable losses, but their definition of acceptable is completely different from ours, the general explained. We consider 10% casualties to be a major defeat that requires immediate withdrawal, but humans regularly sustain 30 or 40% losses and continue fighting as if nothing has happened. The display showed footage from the Battle of Titan Ridge where Captain Nam Jahoon's company had been reduced from 200 soldiers to 37 over the course of 3 days of continuous fighting. But instead of retreating, they had regrouped and launched a night attack that broke the Christian siege and captured the enemy command post. Captain Nam lost over 80% of his force, but he achieved total victory. And when asked how he maintained morale with such devastating casualties, he said that every soldier who died had made it possible for the survivors to complete the mission, and that their sacrifice was honored by continuing to fight. Velthar changed the display to show human medical facilities, and the council watched as human doctors and nurses worked frantically to save wounded soldiers while bombs fell around them, and the medical staff never considered evacuating even when the ceiling collapsed and killed 3 of their colleagues. During the bombardment of Med Station, Alpha Dr. Yu Jiyoung operated on wounded soldiers for 36 hours straight, while our artillery targeted the facility, and when offered evacuation, she refused to leave until every patient was stable, and she said that abandoning wounded soldiers was not something humans did. The general activated a communication recording, and the council heard Dr. Yu's voice as she worked on a critically wounded patient while explosions shook the building around her. The patient needs another hour of surgery, and I'm not leaving until he's stable. So either stop shooting at the hospital or wait until I'm finished, because this boy is going home to his family." She saved 43 soldiers that day, and she died when the ceiling finally collapsed. But her last words were instructions to her assistant on how to complete the surgery she had been performing, and even in death she was still trying to save lives. Council member Velkors shook his head in amazement. "This level of dedication is unprecedented in our experience, General, but surely there must be some way to use this against them, and perhaps we can target their medical facilities or their supply lines to break their morale." Velthar's response came with a warning tone that made the entire council pay attention. "We tried that approach, honored Velkors, and targeting their non-combatants was the worst strategic mistake we could have made, because instead of breaking their morale, it enraged them beyond all reason and made them fight even harder than before." The display showed the aftermath of the Cretan attack on Human Colony 12, where civilian shelters had been targeted, and the human response had been swift and devastating as they launched a counterattack that destroyed 3 Cretan battle groups and recaptured the colony in less than 48 hours. After we attacked their civilians, the humans changed their tactics completely, and they became even more aggressive and more willing to sacrifice themselves, and they started treating every engagement as if the survival of their entire species depended on the outcome, and that is when we began losing entire fleets, instead of just individual ships. Velthar looked around the room at the stunned faces of the most powerful military leaders in the galaxy. "Honored Council, the humans fight with something we have never encountered before, and they fight with something that makes them stronger when they suffer losses instead of weaker, and every atrocity we commit against them just proves to them that we are exactly the monsters they believe us to be." The holographic display changed again, and Velthar's expression grew even more serious as he prepared to explain the aspect of human warfare that had truly shocked him, and the council watched as images of human military units appeared before them, showing soldiers working together in ways that defied everything the Christians understood about individual survival instincts and military hierarchy. "But their individual tenacity is not what makes them truly dangerous," Velthar said, and his voice carried a tone of genuine respect mixed with deep concern. "It is how they function as a collective and how they support each other in ways that make them far more than the sum of their individual parts." The display showed Captain Nam Ji-hoon's company during the siege of New Seoul, and the council watched as the human commanding officer was killed by sniper fire in the opening minutes of the battle, and instead of the expected chaos and confusion that should have followed the loss of leadership, something extraordinary happened that changed Velthar's understanding of human military doctrine forever. "Observe what happens when Captain Nam falls," the general said, and the hologram showed the moment when the human officer died, and his soldiers immediately began coordinating their defense without any apparent communication or discussion about who was now in command. Every single soldier in that company assumed personal responsibility for the mission's success, and they began making tactical decisions as if they were all officers with years of command experience. The council watched in amazement as human soldiers simultaneously moved to secure different strategic positions without anyone giving orders, and they worked together with the kind of coordination that usually required extensive training and communication systems that the humans clearly did not possess. Corporal Jung So-min took command of the eastern defensive line, while Private Lee Dong-yun secured the ammunition depot, and Sergeant Park Kyung-ho organized the evacuation of wounded personnel. And they did all of this without discussing it or arguing about rank or authority, and they simply saw what needed to be done and did it. Velthar paused the display at the moment when the humans launched their counterattack and pointed to the perfect synchronization of their movements. "They coordinated this assault without radio communication because our jamming systems had disabled their equipment. But somehow they all knew exactly when to attack and where to go, and they moved like a single organism with many parts." Council member Zorthak leaned forward with confusion written across his features. "This is impossible, General, because no military force can maintain coordination without proper command structure and communication systems, and what you are showing us defies basic military science." "That is exactly what I thought when I first witnessed it," Velthar replied. "But After studying dozens of similar incidents, I have concluded that humans possess some form of collective tactical instinct that allows them to coordinate effectively even under the worst possible circumstances. The display changed to show the evacuation of Colony 7, where human forces had been tasked with covering the retreat of civilian populations, while massively outnumbered Christian forces advanced on multiple fronts, and the tactical situation should have resulted in the complete annihilation of the human defenders within hours. Corporal Jung Sumin was assigned to hold the eastern evacuation route, Velthar explained. But when she received word that another evacuation point was under heavy attack, she made the decision to abandon her position and march 15 kilometers through hostile territory to provide reinforcement. The hologram showed the young human soldier carrying a wounded comrade on her back while enemy forces pursued them through difficult terrain, and she never once considered leaving the injured soldier behind, even though his weight slowed her down and made them both easy targets for Cretan patrols. When our intelligence officers asked Corporal Jung why she didn't abandon the wounded soldier to save herself, she looked at them as if they had asked her why she didn't stop breathing, and she said that leaving wounded comrades behind was not something humans did, and that she would rather die than break that promise. The display showed the moment when Jung finally reached the besieged evacuation point after carrying her wounded comrade for over 6 hours, and instead of collapsing from exhaustion, she immediately joined the defensive line and helped organize a counterattack that broke the Christian siege and saved over 3,000 civilian lives. She carried Private Kim Ji-won for 15 kilometers through enemy territory, and when she finally reached safety, she immediately began fighting again as if the forced march had been nothing more than a warm-up exercise, Velthar said, and when asked about her actions, she simply said that Kim needed help, and that was all the reason she needed Council Member Sixara, stood up with visible frustration. General, what you are describing goes against every principle of individual survival that drives military effectiveness, and soldiers who prioritize their comrades over their own lives should not be able to maintain unit cohesion. Velthar activated another display that showed human casualty evacuation procedures, and the Council watched as human soldiers risked their lives repeatedly to recover wounded and dead comrades from active battlefields. And they did this even when the tactical situation made such rescues militarily pointless. The humans have a principle they call leave no one behind, and they apply this literally even when it means accepting significant tactical disadvantages. The general explained, during the Battle of Kepler Station, human forces spent precious time and resources recovering the bodies of dead soldiers instead of consolidating their defensive positions. The hologram showed human soldiers advancing under heavy fire to reach fallen comrades, and they did this not once or twice, but dozens of times throughout the battle, and they treated the recovery of their dead as being just as important as achieving their military objectives. Watch Sergeant Kim Tae-won during the final assault, Velthar said, and the display showed the human sergeant coordinating his squad's attack while simultaneously organizing the evacuation of casualties. He could have achieved his objective much faster if he had left the wounded behind, but he refused to advance until every injured soldier was moved to safety. The Council watched as Kim's squad carried their wounded comrades while fighting a running battle against superior numbers, and the tactical burden of caring for casualties should have made them easy targets, but instead, their determination seemed to make them fight even more effectively. Medical Officer Bae Seung-hoon treated wounded soldiers under fire for 12 hours during the siege of Fortress Prime. Velthar continued, and when our forces captured the medical station, they found him still working on a Christian prisoner who had been injured in the fighting. The display showed the human medic applying battlefield dressings to a wounded Christian soldier while human plasma fire erupted around the medical station, and when asked why he was treating enemy wounded Bae, simply said that injured soldiers needed medical care regardless of which side they fought for. He saved the lives of 17 Christian prisoners during that engagement, and when our forces threatened to execute the human wounded in retaliation for our losses, Bae volunteered to take their place if we would spare his patients. Council Member Velcours shook his head in disbelief. This makes no strategic sense, General, because treating enemy wounded provides no tactical advantage, and using medical resources on prisoners reduces the care available for their own forces. That is exactly my point, Velthar replied. The humans don't make decisions based purely on tactical advantage, and they fight according to principles that prioritize protecting life over achieving victory, and this makes them unpredictable and dangerous in ways we never anticipated. The general activated a communication recording, and the council heard human soldiers talking to each other during various battles, and their conversations revealed a level of mutual concern and support that went far beyond normal military camaraderie. Listen to Private Cho Wanbin as he coordinates with his squad during the defense of Colony 7, Velthar said, and they heard the young soldier asking about the welfare of his comrades and sharing his ammunition with others who were running low even though it left him with insufficient rounds for his own defense. Here is Lieutenant Kang Sora organizing the evacuation of civilian populations while under heavy bombardment. The general continued, and they heard the human officer calmly giving instructions to her subordinates, while explosions shook the ground around them, and her primary concern was ensuring that every civilian reached safety before she would consider withdrawing her forces. The display showed human soldiers sharing food and water with wounded enemies, and they did this even when their own supplies were critically low, and Velthar pointed to specific instances where such behavior had actually improved human tactical effectiveness by gaining intelligence from grateful prisoners. They treat their enemies better than most species treat their own allies, the general observed, and this has resulted in significant intelligence gains as captured Chrysian soldiers have provided information about our tactical plans and defensive positions because they were impressed by human medical care and treatment. Velthar's presentation took a darker turn as he activated displays showing human technological adaptations that had caught the Chrysian military completely off guard, and the council watched with growing alarm as examples of human innovation appeared on the holographic screens showing weapons and tactics that had been improvised in the middle of active combat situations using nothing but salvaged materials and desperate ingenuity. Their technology is primitive by our standards, the general began, but they adapt and modify it in ways that completely defy our understanding of proper engineering and scientific principles, and they create effective weapons from civilian equipment faster than our intelligence teams can analyze their new designs. The display showed Colonel Seo Minho working in a damaged human supply depot surrounded by broken mining equipment and civilian machinery, and the council watched as the human officer systematically dismantled industrial tools and reassembled them into something that their sensors could not immediately identify. Colonel Seo took civilian mining equipment designed for asteroid processing and converted it into orbital bombardment weapons that were more accurate than our own artillery systems, Velthar explained, and he did this in less than 6 hours, using only basic hand tools and salvaged electronic components. The hologram showed the moment when Seo's improvised weapons system fired its first shot, and the Chrysian fortress that had withstood 3 days of conventional bombardment was completely destroyed by a single precisely targeted blast from equipment that had been designed to dig holes in rocks. Our engineering specialists spent 2 weeks analyzing the wreckage of that weapon, and they still cannot understand how civilian mining tools were converted into military-grade artillery, the general continued. And when we captured Colonel Seo and asked him to explain his modifications, he said he just looked at what he had available and figured out what needed to be done. Council member Zorthak leaned forward with visible concern. General, are you telling us that human soldiers can create advanced weapons without proper training or engineering support, and that they can do this faster than our specialists can analyze their designs? That is exactly what I am telling you, Velthar replied. And the problem is much worse than just individual innovation, because they share these improvised designs with other units, and their modifications spread through their entire military faster than we can develop countermeasures. The display changed to show Major Kim Ji-ho during the siege of Communications Hub 7, where human forces had been cut off from their command structure and were operating without any contact with their higher headquarters, and the major had decided that maintaining communication was essential for coordinating the defense. Major Kim used children's toys to create a communication network that our intelligence services could not crack, Velthar said, and the council watched as the human officer connected simple electronic games and toys into a complex system that somehow transmitted tactical information across multiple star systems, The hologram showed Kim working with basic electronic components that any child could purchase in a toy store, and he was somehow creating encrypted communication channels that were more secure than the Chrysian military's own classified networks. Our code breakers analyzed those toy-based transmissions for months, and they never discovered how Major Kim achieved encryption that was superior to our own security protocols, the general explained. And when we asked captured human technicians about the system, they said it was just something Kim threw together using spare parts. The display shifted to show Engineer Park Dongwoo working in a damaged human research facility where Chrysian bombardment had destroyed most of the advanced equipment and left him with nothing but salvaged parts and broken machinery to work with. Engineer Park jury-rigged a faster-than-light communication system using salvaged Chrysian components and human coffee-making equipment, Velthar said, and his voice carried a note of disbelief that made the council members shift uncomfortably in their chairs. The hologram showed Park connecting pieces of destroyed Chrysian technology to civilian appliances in ways that should not have been possible according to any known principles of engineering, and the resulting device somehow achieved communication speeds that exceeded even the most advanced Chrysian systems. He used the heating elements from coffee makers as signal amplifiers, and the pressure systems from espresso machines as power regulators, and somehow created a communication device that was faster and more reliable than anything in our own fleet. Council Member Sixara stood up abruptly. "This is impossible, General, because such modifications would require years of research and development and extensive testing, and no individual engineer could create such complex systems using improvised materials." "I thought the same thing," Velthar replied, "but I have documented over 100 similar cases where human soldiers and technicians created effective military equipment from civilian materials, and they did this without access to proper laboratories or engineering facilities." The display showed Lieutenant Yoon Haeun during the Battle of Asteroid Field Gamma, where human forces had been trapped in a debris field and surrounded by Chrysian ships that had superior firepower and defensive systems. Lieutenant Yoon invented a completely new form of space combat, using what she called asteroid surfing, and she used gravitational fields and debris momentum to attack our ships from angles that our defensive systems could not track. The hologram showed human fighters using chunks of rock and metal as shields, and launching platforms while they maneuvered through the asteroid field with impossible precision, and their improvised tactics allowed them to destroy ships that were 10 times larger and more heavily armed. She turned space debris into a weapon delivery system and used asteroid gravity wells to accelerate her fighters to speeds that our sensors could not accurately track. Velthar explained, and her tactics were so effective that we lost 12 capital ships to a squadron of damaged human fighters. The general activated casualty reports that showed the devastating effectiveness of human innovation, and the numbers made the council gasp because the losses were far higher than anything they had experienced in their previous campaigns of conquest. In 6 months of fighting, they have developed 17 new combat techniques that we had never encountered before, and they have improvised 43 different weapons from civilian technology, and they have created communication methods that our intelligence services still cannot understand or intercept. The display showed engineer Oh Ye-jin working on captured Chrysian ships in a human maintenance facility, and the council watched as she systematically improved their design and performance using modifications that their own engineers had never considered. Engineer: "Oh repaired our captured ships better than our own technicians could, and when we recaptured some of those vessels, our specialists discovered that her modifications had actually improved their performance by over 30%. The hologram showed Oh installing human-designed components into Chrysian systems and somehow achieving better results than the original specifications, and when questioned about her methods, she refused to explain her techniques and said that the information was classified. She improved our own technology using her primitive human tools, and when our engineers tried to duplicate her modifications, they could not achieve the same results," Velthar said, "and she did this while working with equipment that was supposedly inferior to our own." The general paused and looked around the room at the shocked faces of the council members. "What makes this even more dangerous is that human innovation accelerates under pressure, and the more desperate their situation becomes, the more creative their solutions become. The display showed multiple examples of human forces turning tactical disadvantages into strategic advantages. Through rapid innovation and improvisation, and their ability to adapt existing technology far exceeded anything the Christians had encountered in their centuries of warfare. They fight with their minds as well as their weapons, Velthar concluded, and every engagement teaches them something new about our weaknesses, while we learn only that our assumptions about technological superiority are meaningless when facing an enemy that refuses to be limited by conventional thinking. Council member Velkors shook his head slowly. General, what you are describing suggests that the humans pose a threat not just to our current military operations, but to our entire technological advantage in future conflicts. That is exactly correct, Velthar replied grimly, because while we fight with doctrine and established procedures, they fight with imagination and creativity, and every day this war continues, they become more dangerous and more unpredictable. The war room fell into a silence so complete that the soft hum of the life support systems seemed loud as thunder, and Velthar deactivated all the holographic displays, leaving only the dim emergency lighting to illuminate the shocked faces of the High Command Council as they struggled to process everything they had just witnessed and learned about their supposedly primitive enemy, Honored Council. Velthar said, and his voice carried the weight of someone who had seen the future and found it terrifying. I have come to understand why we cannot defeat the humans, and it is not because they are stronger than us, or more advanced than us, or more numerous than us, and it is not because our weapons are inadequate or our tactics are flawed. He paused and looked directly at each council member in turn as he prepared to deliver the conclusion that would shatter their understanding of warfare and conquest, and maybe even force them to reconsider everything they believed about their empire's destiny among the stars. It is because they are fighting a completely different war than we are fighting, and they are using rules that we do not understand, and they are motivated by something that we have forgotten how to feel, and they refuse to accept defeat even when defeat is the only logical outcome. Council member Zorthak leaned forward, and his ancient voice trembled with the effort of grasping concepts that challenged 3,000 years of military doctrine. General, please explain what you mean when you say they are fighting a different war. Velthar straightened to his full, imposing height, and his forearms spread wide as he delivered the most important tactical analysis of his career. We fight to conquer territory, and to acquire resources, and to expand our empire's boundaries, and when we achieve these objectives, we consider ourselves victorious, and we move on to the next conquest. But the humans fight to exist, and they fight to protect everything. They love and they fight to ensure that their children will have a future, and they treat every battle as if the survival of their entire species depends on the outcome, because in their minds, it does. The general activated one final holographic display, and it showed not battle footage or tactical analyses, but simple images of human families and children and communities going about their daily lives while war raged in the space above their worlds. Look at what they are really fighting for, Velthar said quietly. Security Chief Lim Sang-yun organized the defense of a refugee camp with nothing but determination and hope, because those civilians represented everything he believed was worth protecting, and he knew that losing meant they would all die. The display showed Lim working frantically to coordinate evacuation procedures, while Christian forces approached the civilian shelter, and he never once considered abandoning the refugees, even though staying to defend them meant certain death for him and his small security team. He could have evacuated with the first transport and saved his own life, but he chose to stay because 3,000 civilians needed someone to organize their defense, and he decided that someone would be him, even if it cost him everything. The hologram shifted to show Engineer Oyejin working on captured Christian vessels, and her face showed the kind of focused determination that came from knowing that lives depended on her technical skills, and that failure meant the death of people she cared about. Engineer O repaired our ships better than our own technicians could, but when we offered her a position in our engineering corps, she refused and said that her loyalty belonged to humanity, and that no amount of money or status could change that fundamental truth. She treated Christian prisoners with the same care she gave to human wounded, because she said that showing mercy to enemies proved that humans were worth defending, and that cruelty would make them into the monsters they were fighting against. Council member Sixara spoke up with confusion evident in her voice. "General, what you are describing sounds like fanaticism rather than military strategy, and surely such emotional decision-making would lead to tactical failures and strategic mistakes." "That is what I thought initially," Velthar replied. "But careful analysis shows that their emotional investment actually makes them more effective rather than less effective, because they fight with complete commitment, and they never hold anything back, and they never accept partial victory when total victory is possible." The display showed Medic Bay Sung-hoon treating wounded soldiers during the siege of Fortress Prime, and his actions demonstrated the kind of selfless dedication that turned ordinary people into heroes and inspired others to achieve things they never thought possible. Medic Bay treated wounded Chrysian prisoners with the same care he gave his own comrades, and when asked why he would waste medical supplies on enemies, he said that treating prisoners humanely was what separated civilized beings from monsters. He saved 17 Chrysian lives during that engagement, and when our forces threatened to execute human prisoners in retaliation, he volunteered to take their place if we would spare the wounded soldiers under his care. The general paused, and when he spoke again, his voice carried something that might have been respect or admiration. He said that a medic's oath was sacred and that he would rather die than break his promise to save lives regardless of which species needed help. Velthar looked around the room and saw that the council members were beginning to understand the true nature of their enemy. These humans have shown us something that we lost somewhere during our 3,000 years of conquest, and they fight not because they love war, but because they love what they are protecting. Every battle makes them stronger because they know exactly why they are fighting, and every loss makes them more determined because they refuse to let their comrades die for nothing, and every day this war continues. They become more dangerous because they are learning, while we are just repeating the same failed strategies. The silence stretched on for long minutes as the council absorbed the implications of everything they had heard, and finally Councilmember Velkors spoke up with a question that everyone was thinking, but no one wanted to ask. "General, what do you recommend we do with this information, and how do we proceed against an enemy that cannot be defeated using conventional military doctrine?" Velthar's answer shocked them more than anything else he had said during his entire presentation. "Honored Council, I recommend immediate cessation of all hostilities and the opening of diplomatic channels with the human government." The council erupted in protests, and angry voices filled the chamber as the most powerful military leaders in the galaxy struggled to accept that their greatest general was advocating surrender to a species they had dismissed as primitive just months earlier. Not because we lack the firepower to destroy their homeworld. Velthar continued over the noise. "We could glass Earth tomorrow if we chose to do so, and we could kill every human in the galaxy within a standard year if we committed our full military resources to the task. But doing so would only prove that we are exactly the monsters they believe us to be, and it would validate everything they have said about our empire and our methods, and it would make us into the kind of beings that destroy entire species rather than accept that some conquests are not worth the cost." The general waited for quiet before delivering his final observation. "I have seen Admiral Park Jin-hyun coordinate fleet actions with the same skill that our best commanders possess, and I have watched Captain Lee Dong-sik inspire his troops to achieve impossible victories through nothing but force of personality and moral conviction. I have witnessed Private Kim Min-jae carry wounded civilians to safety while our artillery fell around him like rain, and I have observed Dr. Yoon So-young operate on injured soldiers for days without rest, because she said that saving lives was more important than her own comfort." Velthar's voice grew quiet, but carried absolute conviction. "These humans have shown me that there is something more important than conquest and more valuable than empire, and they have demonstrated that some things are worth fighting for even when victory is impossible. We cannot overcome humans because they refuse to be overcome, and because they fight for something greater than themselves, and because they have turned warfare into an expression of love rather than hatred. Perhaps the greatest victory would be learning from them rather than destroying Them and perhaps the strongest empire would be one that included them as allies rather than conquered subjects. The council chamber remained silent as the implications sank in and outside the window stars that had once represented potential conquests. Now seemed to watch with patient eyes that had seen the rise and fall of empires and would continue watching long after the current players had left the stage.